Here we are once again, picking up where we left off. The Chronicles of Kera, book number 1, chapter 30. Married to the Lone Wolf. For other chapters, you can look at our YouTube page or on whatever media you're watching right now, and you can find out what happened to these three guys, Rob, John, and George, as they travel to a different planet, looking for a different life, and only finding chaos. Chapter 3. This is your home, Rob. Ikor spread her hands. You are the prince of the blue area, soon to become the king. After I'm through, you'll be the king of Aqua. This is your home, and we're going to the top. She made her way to the bureau again. I thought she was going to look into the mirror. Instead, she pulled out a drawer on the right-hand side. She brought out an ornamental wooden box inlaid with gold leaf. She brought it over to me and handed it to me. I wondered what it was. I took it and just looked at it. Aren't you going to open it? She asked innocently. I opened it without responding. There was a thick gold bracelet in the box. I pulled it out and looked at it. It was beautiful and heavy. Two wolves were molded into the gold facing each other, a large one and a small one. Let me put it on for you, she said, taking it from my hand. She opened a small clasp that I haven't seen until then. And the bracelet folded back. She put it on my wrist and closed it. This bracelet tells everyone in Blue Area that you are royalty and that you are married to the lone wolf Ikor. It frees you to go anywhere in the Blue Area. I arched my brows, but remained silent. What? Aren't you happy? This means I can go anywhere? Yes, but not outside. That will come later. My eyes narrowed. I may be kind and in love, but I'm not stupid. You better believe that. She slapped me on the thigh and stood up. Get ready. We're going to celebrate our wedding officially, and today I'll be made queen. Some of the guard will come for you. I have to prepare everything. I also have to prepare the king and queen for you to meet. After all this time, you'll meet my parents. I forced a smile. I wonder if they were like her. How could she be so violent? She began to walk out. How did you become so angry, Ikor? I asked, like a fool. She paused and looked over her shoulder. Why do you ask things like that right now when I don't have time to answer you? We'll talk about that later, okay? She began to walk and stopped for a moment. Without looking back, she said, people often give back what they receive most of their lives. Had I been loved, I may have been a different person. She continued out the door. Unlike previous times, there was no click or lock behind the door. I fingered the gold bracelet, got up to take a shower. I guess I needed to. I needed to look good for my new in-laws. They were, after all, the queen and king of the whole blue area. I thought of Kara. How could I possibly forget her? I looked at the three stones again. Now I had a golden bracelet on one arm and my particle beam weapon on the other. I looked at the weapon for a moment and sent it a telepathic message. It was fully charged. This changed things, but I still loved Igor. How could I get away from her without killing her? It would take some doing, but I was determined to, somehow. I looked down at the red stones. Where would I go? I wouldn't be welcome on Kera. I had married another woman on these planets. Joining was to the death. Kara would not take me back. This was a macho, horrible society on both planets. How could I live comfortably on any of them? I became angry again. I hated both societies. Here, everything was done violently in the open. On Earth, violence was done psychologically through the withholding of love, and even sometimes the withholding of things necessary for life. I turned on the shower. It seemed like more rain at first, but it was warm and gentle. My mind drifted again. On Earth, when I left, they were still fighting over separate but equal segregation policies. The people in the South had been abused. They had abused the blacks and had used their free labor for more than 400 years. The foundation of the nation had been built on their backs. Now they wouldn't even allow blacks to vote or to share bathrooms or sit in the same places with them, let alone have jobs that were good. Black people would often be lynched and beaten just to keep them in their place just a few years before. That was the open violence. In the North where I lived, they were given the lower paying jobs, and the rent in safe, clean neighborhoods were raised high enough to keep them out. Public transportation was only run during the business hours. Any black person working a second or third shift in the city couldn't get there using public transportation. They were doing the same thing as the South, except in a more subtle fashion. Every once in a while, black people were attacked or beaten, or they were terrorized if they moved into the white neighborhood. They were made invisible in all media except for the news hour when it talked about people being arrested, psychological warfare. Psychological terrorism was at an all-time high in the Western world against anyone who was different. Earth really wasn't better. When I got out of the shower, it went off automatically. I looked on the bed. Several different suits were laid out. My spacesuit had been confiscated and burned the first night I arrived, an attempt to break any connection I might have with the past. At least I was permitted to go to a tailor and get new clothing made to my taste. I got into my skivvies and then chose a black suit. It looked somewhat like kung fu uniforms. It was more downplayed, plain, flat, made out of material that resembled silk. It was soft, a long top coming down to just about the top of the thigh, pearl white buttons buttoning all the way to a Nehru collar. Pants matched. They were very loose and comfortable, soft. I wondered if I was becoming like an earth woman. I was allowed to be more feminine here. So subtle behaviors that I was forced to bury on earth were emerging, like wearing soft things for comfort. I had never done that. I put on my socks and a pair of soft black shoes with white leather soles that were like rubber. I went to the mirror and brushed my hair. I wanted to make sure everything was all right. I looked at the makeup case and shook my head. It hadn't gone that far. The doorbell rang. I had gotten dressed right on time. I went to the door and there were several of the royal guard, all women except for one or two men. The women carried large short swords in one hand and held large shields in the other that resembled the shields of the Roman legion. The two men carried pikes made out of some type of black metal. They were dressed in black, except for several blue stripes across their breastplates and the emblem of two wolves playfully tumbling together on the shields. There they were, two columns of women and men standing at my door. I didn't know what they expected. One of the women at the end of the line looked at me, made a subtle head motion. I walked through the column of soldiers until I got between the two men with the pikes. Everyone did an about face, and we walked towards the royal ball. I walked into a gigantic room. The scene was unreal. A long table stood in front of me with about 50 seats. All the high ups from the blue area, I guessed. There was a beautiful wallpaper all over the room that looked like golden thread woven into pattern on a deep red silk background. There were three large chandeliers hanging from the ceiling over the table, the three hanging over a large carpeted area to the left, where there was a large tiled square in the floor with a mural of two wolves, except this time they were engaged in mortal combat, were exactly the same as the ones over the table. All the way at the far end, I could see Icor, the king and queen, King Ferdinand, and Queen Yoki. What a name. King Yoki, that is. Icor saw me and smiled. Queen Yoki. Icor saw me and smiled. I made my way along the table with every eye on me until I reached her. It was a relief. She stood and took both of my hands. She turned to her mother and smiled. This is Rob. I've been dying to have him meet you. Yoki smiled and took my hand. Welcome to the family, my son. Please sit. Icor moved over and I took her seat. That was a surprise. I'm sorry it took you so long, but these things do take time, more ritual than anything else. Ferdinand pursed his lips. Ritual. Sometimes your rituals outweigh my patience. He looked me over, arched his brows. Off-worlder. I nodded. Far away, from one of the new forgotten planets. He smiled. Never thought you'd make it to space. How much do you know about those planets? I asked. Perhaps I could learn something about the Earth's origins. He tossed several nuts into his mouth before he could answer. Okie. Ferdy was a scientist. I found him on the other side of the planet. She looked at him. The men there are somewhat feminine, but I tamed him eventually. He looked at me and smiled. Just like you will be tamed, young man. Someday you might come to like the feel that you have at the expense of others. He grinned more broadly. I do now. The people who were close enough to hear the conversation began to laugh and talk among themselves. I've been rude, Ferdinand said. Let me introduce you to my younger. This is Lucille. I smiled and nodded. She returned the smile. My pleasure, she said. Very good, Icor. Icor beamed. This one loves me. Even better. I found a beauty. Looks like a model. He's too violent. I sat back in my chair. You have to break him, Ferdinand commented. There are ways. I have broken him, Daddy, but sometimes he snaps. He breaks bones when he does. He can even kill sometimes. He's just too dangerous, Opie said. Better to just do away with him or sell him. Ferdinand rested his elbows. How about maiming? Maiming, I explained. You can't do that. I assure you, young man, that we can do anything we'd like, Oki corrected. He's too handsome. It would be a waste. I'll just have to auction him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These people were talking about auctioning off another human being or maiming him. What kind of place was I in? I looked at Icor to see the reaction on her face as the conversation continued. She seemed quite content. None of it bothered her. I my hand on her forearm and broke in. Would you name me, Icor? There was silence. She looked at me, perplexed for a moment. What are you asking? Would you name me? Of course I would. Don't be silly. I looked at her askance. Don't look at me like that. You know I would. She drank some wine. I love you, you know that. That's why I would do anything to keep you. I'd do it in a second. Her eyes narrowed. And you better believe it. Ferdinand smiled. He seemed quite pleased. I didn't say anything. I didn't even look at her. Lucille motioned to the far end of the table. There he was. There he is, the tall one. She sipped her wine. He's a beauty, Oki said. He thinks I'm from the red area, she chuckled. Are you still posing as a red? Ferdinand asked. I could see the displeasure all over his previously smiling face. She shrugged. I looked down to the far end of the table. There were 3 tall women and 1 man. It was John. He was dressed in something similar to what I was wearing. Our eyes met briefly. I could see the look of surprise on his face briefly before he masked it. I looked down and felt ashamed. The hors d'oeuvres came by. I picked up a small finger sandwich and began to nibble. Looks like we could find some place for him, Oki said. She looked at me. I've heard stories about your skills, though. I think some might be slightly exaggerated. She looked at Icor. But maybe you could tame him. Icor shook her head emphatically. Lucille smiled and looked away. Ferdinand pursed his lips. This is definitely a family. We'll discuss it later, Oki said. No, we won't, Icor said back. There was silence. Maybe you're not ready to be made queen tonight. Were we too presumptuous? Ferdinand asked. She didn't respond. Oki sighed audibly. Let's just get this over with before the dinner is ready. Oki looked at me. This is the ceremony where we turn over our power to the new queen and king. I hope we made the right decision, she said, looking at Icor. Icor was silent. Oki motioned to a waiter. He struck a small gong with a rubber mallet. I wondered if he just stood there all that time just waiting to do that. The large mural carpet beside the tables began to raise up off of the floor until it created a pedestal about 4 feet high. Icor smiled at me. Wish me luck. I wondered what she was talking about. She made her way around the head of the table. The king and the queen followed, each carrying what looked like stainless steel cylinders. They climbed up the stairs at the back of the pedestal, which were on the far side, out of view. She held her arms high, and the crowd cheered. The king and queen opened the cylinders and placed them around her forearms. They were actually some type of metal wristbands. They clasped them closed and then came back to their seats. The crowd cheered again. At the rear of the room, I could see the guards forcing 3 women to come up to the pedestal. They were all bound. The crowd made hissing sounds. It looked like a wrestling match or something. I wondered what type of violence was going on here. Icor moved around, shuffling and bobbing like a boxer. Elke stood and hushed the crowd. The great day has come, the day when my daughter will become queen of Blue Area, when, not if, she is successful. Everyone cheered. She hunched once again, hunched the crowd. To be leader of the Blue Area, one must exhibit power, ferocity, and fearlessness. The first step is to take what should belong to us. She motioned to Ferdinand, who smiled, and then to me. The second step is to break what should belong to us. And the third step is to defend the kingdom from those who would hinder our freedom, the freedom to be women. She motioned to the 3 prisoners, and people began to hiss. These are 3 of the so-called security police from the gray area. They were captured by my daughter, Lucille. John looked at her angrily. but remain silent. When Ikor has proven herself by vanquishing these three beasts, she will be queen, and we will retire to some nice, quiet part of the blue area. She looked at Ferdinand, and they both smiled. Do you have anything to add, my love? Ilke asked. Let's get on with this before the dinner gets cold, he said with a smile playing on his lips. The people around the table laughed, and then the battle was on. Prisoner number one was untied on the skirt of the square ring and given a short, thick sword. I could stood there in a fighting stance. The stance looked deadly. The stairs were retracted. The woman looked around, as if confused for a few moments. Then she began to fight for her life. She began to twirl the hairy sword by its hilt easily, like she had been used to doing so. It was moving fast. She stepped towards Ikor, used the twirling motion of her body and the momentum of the spin to bring the sword down, first up in a high arch, and then down towards Ikor's head. Ikor stepped in instead of stepping back. She lifted her arm, catching the full impact of the sword on one of the wristbands. The blade glanced off as she stepped in and caught the woman full in the face with a wild hoe. As the woman staggered back, Ikor charged in with several straight blows to the face, followed up by slamming the wristband into her temple. She dropped the sword and collapsed. Blood flowed freely from one ear. The crowd went wild. The second prisoner began to shout, "This was not to the death. You lied to us." She turned to the crowd. "This is unlawful. You know that. It's against your own laws." Lucille stood up and threw a piece of bread at her. "Shut up, you vile coward." People began to throw things and spit at her. It took quite some time to calm them down. Some of the waiters went onto the podium and cleaned it off between the battles. The young servant, charged with maintaining order, shouted, "Please refrain from throwing things." She was pelted with food herself. After all the mayhem came round two, I couldn't stand it. They were murdering people who could defend themselves, but who didn't really seem to be killers. They seemed to be just ordinary peace officers captured by thieves and cutthroats to be murdered. I looked at Ikor. She was very happy with what she was doing. She had been hurt at some time during her childhood and had turned to hurting others. There comes a time, however, when one must take responsibility for his or her own behavior. She was vile and mean. I felt a deep love for her, but there was no way that I could be her husband. I didn't agree with this, or with Ferdinand, Ilke, or Lucille. This whole planet made me sick. I just happened to look at the far end of the table. John and I made eye contact again. This time there was anger in our eyes. I tapped my wristband. He nodded, ever so slightly. "Send number two up here," Ikor shouted. "The soup's getting cold." Everybody laughed. She stood and was forced onto the podium. Her hands were freed and she was given a sword. This woman didn't look like the first prisoner. She was very short and thin, almost 5'9", 5'10", which was short for this planet. She had a very small frame and seemed a bit uneasy, even though there seemed to be skill in the way she handled the sword. She held the sword with both hands in a low defensive position. She rocked from side to side so she could move quickly. Ikor thought she was afraid and rushed her. The woman sidestepped, brought the sword upward, trying to catch Ikor under the ribs. She almost succeeded, but Ikor blocked with a down block at the last second. This happened 2 or 3 more times until Ikor caught on. When number two went for her ribs, she moved onto the side. This time she reached under the blade with the hand close to the hilt. and brought it upwards, and she down-blocked the sword, striking it in the tip. The sword flew through the air, end over hand, planted itself right in front of me, sticking out of the table. There was a moment of awe, and then the room exploded in applause. Cora began to take her bow. While this was happening, the third prisoner broke loose, charged toward the pedestal. She dove on the floor and rolled, coming up somehow with her hand in front of her. One of the guards rushed to grab her. She ducked underneath her. Hammer blew her in the river with both hands. He grabbed the hilt of the guard's sword as she continued moving behind her and kicked her in the back of the knee. The guard tumbled forward and she freed the sword and threw it to the one at the pedestal before they could reach her. Icor only smiled, and prisoner number two quickly picked up the sword. I looked at the sword in front of me. I realized this was my chance. This was do or die. All eyes were on Icor. I jumped up onto the table and grabbed the sword by the hilt. Lucille tried to jump up too. I kicked her in the chest and she fell back into her seat. Icor was rushing towards prisoner number two. I simply reached out with the sword and tripped her feet, and then brought the sword down on top of Lucille's head. In the meantime, Icor had fallen onto the sword of number two. I kicked Ilky hard. People rushed to protect their king and queen, but they were too late. The shield came up, full power. For the first time since I had it, swords bounced off. Ray guns were useless against this technology. My fists were like iron, steel, and so were John's. We began to work over the whole court of the blue area as we fought our way out. When we exited, two people were on our heels. They were the two prisoners trying to escape. We let them out first and then turned to face the crowd. John set his particle beam weapon on wide dispersal and fired. Right before my eyes, I saw everyone sitting at the table. All of the leadership of the blue area vaporized. I looked at him in disbelief. I knew he was a martial artist. He had also been one of the most kind people I had ever known. He could have just stunned them at least. I was shocked. What he had done felt right, but it still seemed wrong, especially coming from him. He pursed his lips and turned to me with a stern look on his face. "Don't look at me that way," he said. "You don't know what they did to me, and you probably never will." He looked back into the empty room. "They did it to me, but I intend to make sure that they never do it to anyone else." I shrugged. What could I say? They were rotten fool beasts anyway, so who cared? What followed for the next hour or two was a two-man massacre as we literally fought our way out of the blue area. Along the way, we found guards who had been killed by the prisoners on their way out. We made our way out and headed to the forest. The communicators connected to the wristband were opening since they were fully charged. Thank God for the artificial light of blue area. I pushed the comm button to call the ship as we headed for the landing area. I almost hoped that some raiding party would come out so we could roast them. I could feel the anger welling up inside me, covering over the sorrow that I felt for having to kill Icor. Icor was a monster, but also the victim of an unjust and angry system that created monsters. I only hoped that what we did would destroy the blue area, or at least destroy the system that created her. Her death wouldn't be in vain. I removed the heavy golden bracelet. It opened easily. I looked at the two playful wolves. Tears came up in my eyes, so I lowered the shield and let the raindrops wash them away. I noticed that John had been watching me all the time. I forced a smile and dropped the heavy golden bracelet. It hit the ground with a thud. "You don't know what happened to me here either, John." Someday maybe we can both talk about it. He gave a slight nod and lowered his shield too. We waited for just a few minutes until we saw a shiny silver object breaking through the clouds. It descended slowly and hovered just in front of us, about 20 feet above. It slowly descended to the ground. The door opened and a set of stairs extended to the soft wet earth. George stood in the doorway. John and I made our way up the steps, and we all went back into the ship. We are home safe. We were home safe for now. Still, not really knowing what to expect. Stay tuned. Hit the like, leave a comment, hit the bell for notifications if you would like to get us to be able to make more videos like this and perhaps better ones, even though I doubt we could make them better than this. Thanks for being with us and look forward to more videos in the future. Have a great day.